This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
Back into the book of Judges, and it's been a long time, has it not? Does anybody remember who the last person we covered in the Judges was? My wife says Gideon, with an inflection of I'm not sure. Does anybody want to correct her? Or is she right? Well, that's partially why I plan to do something a little different today. We're going to do the book of Judges, yes, but this is going to somewhat tie to Sunday school and somewhat tie to other things. I want to connect the book of Judges, as it were, again, to the rest of Scripture and get kind of the big picture of where we're at and how and why this book is significant. Since we are, in a sense, restarting the book, I've also renamed my subtitle. And I've added to it because I really don't know, some of these guys who preach through sermons and they have the perfect subtitles, whatever, from the beginning, I don't know how they do that, because as you go through a book, it's like, man, this kind of develops and grows. But I've changed it from the story of God's people becoming like God's enemies, and I've added the phrase, while God remains committed to His people. Because throughout this, we've had our ups and downs of the book. God has remained faithful to His people when they were directly opposed to Him. And so the purpose of this sermon will be to review, and it'll be a very broad brush of Scripture again. And I'm, in one sense, I feel sorry for that because we don't have like one text we're starting in per se. But on the other hand, by next week, we'll be right back into the text, verse by verse, going through this book and seeing how it plays out. And so, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes, when you're looking big picture, you can't see the beauty in the details. So this will be one of those sermons where we're going to zoom out, kind of recap where we've been, where we're going. And I'm going to introduce the book again, but in a fresh way that's a little different from when I did before. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll dive right in. Lord, we thank You for Your word. And this morning, as I reintroduce the book of Judges, it's been over a month since we've been here in this book. It is my purpose to tie connection points between this book and the rest of Your word. And Lord, I ask that as I do so this morning, You would ground us in Your word. As we read our Bibles this year, would Your story recorded in Your word cut grooves deep in our minds and our thought and our behavior? Would it change how we live? And Lord, as we go through the Old Testament stories of failures and successes, would we learn from those examples? And ultimately, would You make each of us more like Christ? Lord, this morning, help clear out the distractions of our minds. And may we walk away challenged to walk by faith in a new area of life this week. We ask this in Your Son's name. Amen. Several times I've introduced this book as it is connecting Joshua to the kings. And in that Joshua, we have the conquest, and then you have the book of Judges and Ruth, kind of together. And then you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, which bring a king, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, which I didn't plan this, but last week's sermon where I covered 1st and 2nd Kings and the history there, it's not much better than the book of Judges in some regards. I want to take a step back from this and even get a bigger, broader brush of how this fits in. And part of the reason maybe I have such a passion to do this is one of the things I grew up going to Sunday school every week and one of the things I feel like I didn't get well growing up, and I'm not trying to fault those who were in leadership or whatever, I didn't get the big picture of the Bible. Like, I understood the story of the gospel. I understood how Christ died for my sins. I understood that in some way the Old Testament led up to that, but there was a lot of gaps in my thinking. And so this morning, and part of why maybe I bring this up so often, is I want the big picture as we kind of zoom in and out of Scripture. I want you to see the continuity and the flow, and I want you to see what God's doing, so that when you go home and you read your Bible, and maybe you get stuck in an obscure passage and you're like, I have no idea what's going on here. At least you have some framework of what we're getting towards, what's happening, where we're going. And so, let me take a bigger picture. And in some ways it'll feel a little repeat from Sunday school, I suppose. But in Genesis 1 and 2, we read the story of how Adam and Eve are created. The world is created. Everything we know of, everything that exists, it's all created by God, and after each day it is good. Except the 6th day, and that's when God says it was very good. Now, all of that is wonderful. God places Adam and Eve in the garden. He puts them there. He has a purpose and a plan and a design for them. They're in communion and fellowship with Him. And it's not far into the story of the Bible we read of the fall, where man turns their back on God. We have Adam and Eve in chapter 3, taking of the fruit, disobeying God's command. And in doing so, as they disobeyed God, they severed the relationship with Him. The end result is, yes, sin has infected the human race, but they're also banished or kicked out of the garden. And the question is, like, will we ever be able to be back in God's presence again? Now, they had the hope, as we mentioned in Sunday school, that there would come someone from the seed of the woman, which is interesting that that's used, because it's usually talked about from the seed of the man, but interesting in the New Testament, it's a virgin birth. It's the seed of a woman. That the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. The serpent, the one that in Eden had come to Eve and deceived her and tricked her, as it were, into eating the fruit. Now, I have here Genesis 3 to 11 because that's not the only story of failure. Genesis 6 is another story of failure. And Genesis 11, where they build the Tower of Babel and they're in rebellion and resistance against God, there is a theme repeated. God does something good. God creates something wonderful. God does something on behalf of His people, and they turn their back on Him. This theme goes on. Genesis 12, we read of God calling Abraham. And we have the great promise to Abraham that he would have a nation and a land and a people, and God would give this to him. And in that, He said, and through you I will make all the nations of the earth to be blessed. That's hearkening back to that Genesis 3:15 with the Messiah, as it were, who would crush the serpent's head. It's hearkening back to there, but also hearkening forward. How on earth would Abraham and his family, his line, bless the whole world? And in Galatians, Paul brings that together and really clarifies it really well. That blessing came through the person and work of Jesus Christ. So there's this looking forward that there's this good thing that's going to happen. God starts with a man, Abraham and Sarah. He's going to build a nation, and God's going to do this. And you would think this is going to be a godly family. But then it's not too far into the book of Genesis. In Genesis, and I put here 28 to 45, we read about some of Jacob's family. Jacob was Abraham's grandson. Jacob is the one who has 12 sons, which become the 12 tribes. Now, this isn't too far removed from Abraham. This is, his grandson. And if we're honest, when we read the pages of Scripture, you don't want your family to be like Jacob's. Selling off their brother into slavery? That's a great idea. Or where Judah hires a harlot who he doesn't even realize is one of his own family members. And then he's going to have her put to death because she's pregnant until she holds up and says, hey, the guy who got me pregnant, this staff and this, what else did she have? This, what's that? Signet ring? This belongs to him. And Judah's kind of caught. Or we read about Levi and Simeon, who their daughter is raped and abused by the people of, was it Shechem? Help me out here. And so in response, I say, well, tell you what, if all of your people get circumcised like we are circumcised, then, we'll marry you and you can marry our family and we'll just kind of grow. And so the king of Shechem and his son go to the leaders of Shechem and say, hey, this is a great idea. Let's do this. So after all the men are temporarily incapacitated, Levi and Simeon come in and slaughter everybody. Is this the type of family you want to live in? But this is the family coming from Abraham. Do you see kind of the mess here? And so you begin to wonder, how is God going to work through a bunch of knuckleheads like this? And we read of how through that God does work. In fact, Joseph is raised up by God within this messed up family. He's sold out of the family. But he's used by God to deliver his people. There's a famine in Egypt, or in the whole land. Joseph has, and I'm really flying by high here, Joseph has been put into a position of power and leadership. He's gone through prison. He's been accused by Potiphar's wife. His life, he could have been a bitter, mean person after everything he went through. But he trusts God. He lives faithful. Not that he's perfect, but God uses him to then deliver his family. And ultimately, the family of Jacob, they end up in Egypt. They end up down in Egypt, provided for by the Egyptians, but ultimately by God himself. So God's done something good for his people, but by Genesis 1 and 2, Israel find themselves in slavery. Now this isn't, as opposed to the pattern so far, this isn't necessarily their own fault or doing. Although from one perspective, there may be seeds of why this happened. How does any group of people feel when another group of people have privilege and power and wealth? They tend to not like it. My alarm on my phone, it must be a new thing with the phone I have. My old phone didn't do it, but my new phone does. When I set an alarm, it'll start buzzing, and it'll say good morning or whatever, and it'll start giving me news headlines, and it gives me the top headlines of the news, which it's kind of interesting because those headlines are only a snippet of the truth, and sometimes the headlines are over here, and the reality is over here, but nonetheless. Well, this morning the headline that came across was how Mitch McConnell and Pelosi, both of their houses were vandalized yesterday in the last couple days because people didn't get their stimulus. It didn't get passed through or whatever the way they wanted. Now, there is no excuse for that type of behavior, all right? Whether things went your way or not, there's no excuse for vandalizing someone's house. But you see some of the threads here. Now, think through the story of what happens with Joseph in Egypt. Joseph comes to power. He comes to power through a series of God-divined and directed events. Joseph is pulled out of prison to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh or the king. The butler and baker had been in prison. Joseph interpreted their dreams. The king then has, a year or so later, it was actually on his birthday, the king has this dream. The butler says, hey, there was this guy in prison who he could interpret dreams. Let's bring him out and So Joseph interprets the king's dreams. And Joseph says to the king, look, God is giving you revelation, Pharaoh. God is giving you a picture of what he's going to do. He's going to bring 7 good years. that are going to be you're going to have a bumper crop in these 7 good years, but then are going to come 7 bad years. And in the 7 years of famine, it's going to be so bad, all the extra and the bonus and the surplus from the previous years will be wasted and gone. And so he's warning you, king, to prepare for this. And Pharaoh's response is, well, I haven't found anybody as wise as this and can interpret dreams. And so he appoints Joseph as the leader or the king not king, but second in command of Egypt. Joseph then begins to lay up store. He begins to put things aside for the government. And what happens when the years of famine come, the Egyptians themselves, the people, begin to lose what they have. They sell off, they begin to buy grain from Pharaoh. When their money's gone, they sell off their cattle and they sell off their land, and ultimately they sell themselves into servitude. There has been a massive consolidation of power taking place in Egypt. And who was seated next to Pharaoh assisting with this consolidation of power? It was Joseph. Now, the Bible gives us no commentary on whether what Joseph was doing here was right or wrong. So I'm not going to commentary on there either. But I'll say this. Do you see why the Egyptian people themselves might look at the Egyptians when through these 7 years they've sold themselves into slavery? They've lost what they own. Now the Pharaoh owns about everything. But these Israelites are doing pretty well. I think that's part of why there was a resistance. And then the Bible tells us the next Pharaoh, there rose up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And this is when Israel finds themselves in trouble. And we read it, and we've gone through this story in Sunday school over the last couple of years. God delivers His people from Egypt because this new Pharaoh decides to make the Israelites slaves. He puts them out of power, and he puts his own people, as it were, over them as taskmasters. These Israelites are then in bondage in Egypt, and this is the story we know and remember. But God delivers His people and begins to make a covenant with them. They see Egypt decimated. They see the plagues of Egypt happen. They cross the Red Sea. They see the armies of the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea as God folds the water back in on the Egyptian army. They sing a song of deliverance in chapter 15 of Exodus as they after crossing the Red Sea. They celebrate what God has done. God then leads them back to Mount Sinai, the place where Moses had the burning bush experience with God. He leads them there. They enter into a covenant with God. And before the covenant is completed and Moses is down from the mount, what are the people doing at the bottom? They're building a golden calf and entering into idol worship, idolatry. And we have this pattern again happen where God is doing something good and amazing. He's pulling His people out of Egypt. He's making them into a nation. This going through the Red Sea is kind of the point at which they're really being solidified into a nation. And on Mount Sinai, they're getting laws from God of how they're to live as a people and a nation. He will be their ruler, and He will guide them and direct them, and He will bless them. And in the middle of this, they blow it again. And they turn to their own way. They turn to false gods. Now we've been going through the book of Numbers, and Numbers 1 to 10. Israel's getting arranged, they're getting a census, everything's getting in order. It's kind of excited because now we're going to leave Mount Sinai and we're moving towards the promised land. We're going to enter into that place God has given us. But along the way, as we've recounted, Israel complains and rebels multiple times. They come to Kadesh Barnea in chapter 13, and the spies are sent into the land. And this is in one sense another high point. Because look at what God is going to give us. This is a peek, as it were. This is a peeking under the wrapping paper of the present, looking at what you're about to get soon. This is anticipating, looking forward. But the result of this, before chapter 13 is done, is, remember, as the kids' song says, 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. And 10 of those spies come back with fear and dread and biting their fingernails saying, we can't do this. We can't conquer the land. We can't make it because we're like grasshoppers in their sight. Oh, it's a good land, but there's no way we can do it. Never mind the fact we crossed the Red Sea. Never mind the fact God has provided manna. Never mind the fact God's had water come out of the rock. Not once, but twice. Never mind the fact that God decimated Egypt with the 10 plagues. Never mind any of that. We can't conquer Canaan. We can't conquer the land. We can't inhabit the land God's given us because we're not big enough. Were you big enough for anything else? And their rebellion leads to a period where they wander for 40 years while that generation dies off because of their unbelief. Now, you see the pattern. It just keeps going and moving on here. This goes into then the book of Joshua, which kind of gets closer to where we are here with the book of Judges. Joshua comes after the book of Numbers. Joshua is, as we were talking about Sunday school, kind of that fifth cycle of their journey from Numbers chapter 33, and it's them taking the land. And the book of Joshua overall is victory. There's a few defeats in there, like at Ai, or when they get deceived by the Gibeonites. There's a few defeats that happen when they don't trust God, when they lean on their own understanding, when they go their own way. But in some ways, I'll put it this way. It's kind of like if you look at the stock market. If you look at a 1-hour chart of the stock market, you see lots of up and downs. It's hard to tell what's happening. But you change the scale to, okay, I want to see a 1 day. And you see overall what's going to happen. And then you say, I want to see a month or a year. And all those little ups and downs, over time, you kind of see a bigger pattern of up or down. Does that make sense? And I don't know if I've never done any stock trading, so I don't know much about it. I was helping someone with the technical side at one point of currency trading, and I was showing him how to use the software, even though I was learning. I didn't do any trading myself. But you see these charts going up and down, those candle charts. The story of the Bible seems to be like that too. And if you're going to look at the isolated chapters and incidents in the book of Judges, there's some times they failed. But you could say the book of Judges is victory surprised by defeat. Where in some of the other books of Scripture, we see more defeat than we do victory. That leads into the book of Judges, the book we've entered into to preach and teach from. It's Judges and Ruth kind of together. Ruth is somewhat like the appendix to Judges. And Israel here, after being given the land, after being given victory, after Joshua gives his parting words and says, be faithful to the Lord, follow Him, obey Him, serve the Lord, go finish the job that we started. The Judges period has been a period where Israel as a whole turns their back on God. And there's these little blips, these little points of faith where they trust God, these little points where God raises up a judge and for a period they do well, but overall it's on a decline. That leads us to 1 and 2 Samuel, where, again, kind of the blips up and down are here, where God begins this process of a king and preparing for a king. But the first king of Israel, Saul, he started off pretty good, but he tanked real quick, pursuing his own adventures. In fact, he gets to the point he's pursuing David, trying to kill him. And at one point he acknowledges, I've been the fool. I've been chasing after you when you have done nothing wrong. Of course, then a few chapters later, he's chasing David again. So, did he really repent? But God prepares David, a king, a man after God's own heart. But even in the life of David, there's things we go, wait a minute, David. When you're hiding out with your men and telling the Philistine guy that you're doing this, but you're really doing that, and this is before you're king. And then after you become king, and after you unite the kingdom, and after things have kind of gelled together, and God has really given you, as it were, towards the end of your life, somewhat of a period of peace, you commit adultery with Bathsheba, and then lie about it, and have Uriah killed to cover it up, and then you kind of go off the pages with your family trying to kill you with Absalom. I mean, this is, there's hope, but there's not hope. There's that twinge of, this isn't perfect. And yet in 1st and 2nd Samuel, that's where that 2nd Samuel promise in chapter 7, that God would raise a king who would rule from the line of David forever. That messianic king. That messianic figure tied to the one who, in the Abrahamic promise, would bless all nations. Tied to the one in the promise to Adam and Eve that the serpent's head would be crushed. There's a tying in and a moving forward of this story. And so as God raises a king, yes, as a whole we've moved forward. We're moving in the right direction, but there's been some setbacks. And last week we talked about the story of the kings, how after one king, after another, who pursue their own pursuits, their own agendas. They turn their back on God, and after 20 kings in the north and 20 kings in the south, after the kingdom gets split, they run Israel and Judah, the two separate nations now, right into the ground. This leads then to what we call the exile. And the exile, God removes His people. They're taken away to Babylon. They're away from God's land that He's given them. But God allows them to return. And we read in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read about three figures, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel, who didn't make it in the notes because the block could only be so big. And God allows His people to return. And when they return from exile, this is exciting. This is wonderful. This is good because we're now back in the land. Nehemiah spearheads the effort to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Ezra is spearheading a religious reform and repairing the temple. And all seems to be going well, and they get this second temple put together. But there's something wrong. As they finish the temple, and they have a service to commemorate the temple, God's presence does not come down on the temple. Now, in the Old Testament, when they finished the tabernacle, God's presence came down. His Shekinah glory was there. They saw it. When Solomon dedicated the temple that he had built in Jerusalem, God's presence came down. Cloud and fire. They could see it. It was there. When this second temple was built under Ezra and Nehemiah, it tells us that the young generation were rejoicing, but the old generation was weeping because it didn't match the glory of the previous one. God's presence had not and did not come down on that temple. So you have a people now back in the land that God has given them, but the symbol and sign of God's presence is not there. I'm not saying God didn't bring them back. I'm not saying God didn't have His hand at work. I'm not saying any of that. In fact, we have books of the Bible like Esther where God's name is not mentioned, but the fingerprints and the hand of God are all over it. And here we enter into a period you will not find in your Bible. It's been called the intertestamental period. There's, we believe, two testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But if you turn to Malachi in your Bible, the difference between the last page of Malachi and the first page of the book of Matthew is about a 500-year span where God is silent. Now, I'm not saying God wasn't working. God wasn't inactive. We read of the Maccabees and some other things that happened in that time. It's not in our Bible. And in a sense, it was as if the story of the Old Testament, it had all been leading to this person, this figure, we call him the Messiah, the one who would rule from the line of David, who would crush the seed of the serpent, the one who would, through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. But it's a story with no ending. And the intertestamental period is a time when, in a sense, Judaism, closer to what we know today, begins to grow and develop. It's a time when you could say it was a period where people practiced religion without the presence of God. They got used to not having the presence of God. That presence of God that we talked about already today, that was there in the garden, that was there in the tabernacle, that was there in the temple, they got used to going through form and religion. They made up all sorts of rules and regulations in this time frame. there was all sorts of additions, and they kept, it was almost as if we do enough, if we make enough rules and regulations, if we do enough of that, maybe God will come back. And they had been exiled, as it were, they missed the presence of God. But after that period of silence, the Gospels come. And here Jesus enters into the story. This is God's presence come in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Jesus enters on in the New Testament like the New Testament is a story that doesn't have a beginning, and the Old Testament is a story that doesn't have an end. He's continuing on that story. That king from the line of David, that serpent crusher, that person. Which is why we've just celebrated Christmas with God, with Christ being born, and we have the term or phrase Emmanuel, God with us. Where was God in the Old Testament? As they understood it and they saw it, yes, God was everywhere, but His presence was made manifest and known in the tabernacle and the temple. And Jesus comes on the scene. And the writers of the gospel make it very clear, Christ walking on earth was God's presence among His people. God with us. In fact, the gospel writer John, in the first chapter of John, he makes this very explicit. In 1 John 14, a verse you may know and have memorized, it says, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us." Now this is where the fun part comes in. The word dwelt there is not the normal word for dwell. It's the word for tabernacle. Now think about that. The Word was made flesh and tabernacled among us. Where was God's glory and His presence made known? In Israel. It was in that tabernacle. And later on the temple. John's making a deliberate and a clear connection. This is the presence of God walking among His people. This is significant. And so, there's this pattern back and forth, and I know as we've gone through this, there's a bit of inversion in how I have it laid out on these charts. But God does good things for His people. God puts them in a good place. God enables them. God equips them. God does good things for His people. And where have we as humans, time and time and time again, we have gone to idols. We've gone to our own way. We've gone to our own agenda. We've gone to what we think will work. Judges is fitting within this pattern and this story. And as we tie back in and bring back to the book of Judges, Judges is pointing us, remember it's the story of Judges as what we call them, but in a sense they're deliverers. But all of these deliverers are faulty. But there will come a deliverer who's not faulty. There will come Christ, who will be that perfect ruler, who will be that perfect king, who will be that perfect Israelite, who will be that perfect man. He will never fail in any way, in any regard, and He will lay His life down on your behalf and mine. He will be a deliverer unlike any of these judges or deliverers from the book of Judges. We noted as we dug into this book, and this will become very familiar to you, I think, but they failed to obey God and drive out the Canaanites. And that led to their corruption and this cycle of sin and oppression and repentance, deliverance, and then they have peace and go right back into it again. And then the book of Judges ends out with the corruption of the people. We've been in the book of Judges and we're working through this section where these judges, their corruption is kind of this downward spiral. Again, my illustration of like the stock market probably fits here well, and I probably should have had a few pictures of that to give you just a perspective. But we've gone from the judges who seem to be pretty good, like Othniel, who has nothing bad to say, to Ehud, who it seems like a pretty good judge, but it seems like his action and his behavior are more out of the page book of an Canaanite assassin's manual than it is out of how God would do things. Then you have Deborah and Barak, where Barak's too afraid to go fight unless Deborah comes along. And we've entered into the story of Gideon. And really, I've covered the story of Gideon, and the next phase for what I plan to cover next week will be some of the fallout of Gideon's rule. Because his son Abimelech really creates a mess. And the judges are only going to get worse from here. But as we've gone through the story of Gideon, let me remind you where we've been so next week we can jump right in. Gideon was called by God. You remember he's in the winepress. He's afraid. He's hiding from the Midianites. He's pressing the grapes, or not he's pressing grapes. He's threshing wheat in a winepress because he's afraid. He builds, God says, I'm going to use you to defeat the Midianites. He doesn't believe it at first, but then ultimately he does build this private altar to God. He then tears down the altar in his dad's backyard. And so he's kind of going from a private encounter with God to more of a public. He then builds this public altar. He then is prepared by God to battle the Midianites. And then, in the same way that Gideon tested God, God turns the tables. And remember, Gideon had thrown out that fleece several times. God, will you really do this? When God said he would. He threw out that fleece, and then God turns the tables, and God tests him by, well, let's let your army get dwindled down to about 300 and see how we do. And so he's dwindled the army down, but God gives him the victory. Gideon pursues the enemy, but we covered at the end of his life how he kind of went beyond his boundary of what he was supposed to do. He got into a vengeful retaliation of things against his own family. He wins the day, but he establishes himself, as it were, as king. He takes the ornaments and the goods of a king. He takes gold from the people like a king. He sets up an ephod. And we're not 100% sure what that is, whether it was he just put made an ephod breastplate that he would wear, or whether he set up an idol type thing with an ephod on it. But the people would now come, and he led the people back into idolatry. Gideon did all this. Next week, we're going to get into his son Abimelech. His name means my dad is king. And we're going to see this downward spiral here as well. But as I've taken you through, at this point, from Genesis to the Gospels, kind of zooming in and out, into and out of the book of Judges, I have one question this morning. What is the trajectory of your life? The reality is God has been good to you and to me, but the question is, how do we respond? We have been given so many good things in life, and yet I think all too often we find ourselves like the children of Israel complaining. We have been forgiven by God. We have had, if you've trusted Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you are washed in the blood, your sins have been forgiven, and yet how we forget that when somebody sins against us. We forget that those sins have been paid for on the cross. We forget that Christ called us in this life to even suffer and die for His sake. And do we live as if God is dwelling in us? That presence of God that was in the garden, that presence of God that they saw in the temple and the tabernacle that was missing from the second temple, that presence of God in the person of Jesus Christ as He walked here in this earth. Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians, he says, what? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? Do you and I live as if we are temples? As our lives are sacred space? I think some of the most helpful ways to understand sacred space is when you go to a mechanic's garage. There is a space that they may keep perfectly clean because that's where they put the vehicle they're working on. Does that make sense? When you go into a surgery room or surgical room, they don't let just anybody in there. They don't let just anything in there. The tools that come out to cut you open and to do that, they often come in little baggies that have been sealed because they've been cleaned. And they keep them perfectly clean until they're ready to be used. Why do they do that? This is a special space and a special place for a special purpose. That's why we put things in the refrigerator. It's a special place for a special purpose. Temples were special places with special purpose of, as it were, dwelling with God there. And you and I, our lives are special and unique. And what I'm not saying is that, okay, you can't go anywhere. Like, you have to like live in this little bubble and you can't do anything. Because what we see in Jesus, in the Old Testament, there was this apprehension or restrictions and rules. The priest's job was to keep sacred space, to keep it from being defiled. In Isaiah, we read of when Isaiah has his vision, the cherubim come to him and put a coal to his lips, and it purifies him. That's the first glimpse we have of something different, where usually sacred space or what's pure becomes defiled by what's impure. There's something a little different happening in Isaiah. And the time we get to the New Testament, we have Jesus going around touching and healing and living among poor, sick, sinful folk. And He changes them. You and I are not to be like the Old Testament, where we so isolate from everything and everyone in the world that we're trying to keep our own little space perfect. But we're to be like Christ in the New Testament, where we walk in and among people, but we're careful not to defile ourselves. In this passage in context, Paul is dealing with sexual sins, and he's saying, if you are united to Christ, you don't get involved in this type of behavior. You don't do this because you're dragging Christ into this with you. How we live matters, and it's a radical idea that we are the presence of God here on earth. And we like to sometimes separate out, yep, Paul talked about sexual sins there, I'm good. But how about with our attitudes and approaches to life? How about when we get bitter and upset and angry and we show that publicly? Remember, you're an example. You're a testimony. You're a temple of the Holy Ghost. And it impacts those around you. And lastly here, as we kind of close this out, do you live as if God is indwelling other believers? You see, when Christ walked on this earth, He was the presence of God here. He was 100% man, 100% God, walking in and among His humanity and laying His life down. But we read in the book of Acts of the Holy Spirit coming and indwelling the believers. And like I said with what Paul said, how we are the temple of the Holy Ghost. But it's not just me that's a temple, it's you too. And sometimes, when you walk into certain places, your behavior will almost naturally change. For most people, you walk into a big library, most people are they get quiet. Now, maybe not kids, maybe not young people, and maybe not our local library, because that seems to have changed in our local culture. But libraries are places you're quiet. When you walk into maybe certain buildings or whatever, your behavior may change accordingly. This is one reason, I'm not endorsing it, but this is why, like when you walk into a cathedral, like the Catholics, they do a really good job in their architecture of making it beautiful in a sense of awe and wonder. And yet I think theologically they are missing a lot of the core of what's happening. But there's this, when I was in India, we walked into a couple Anglican churches, and you walk in and everybody gets real quiet and they don't want to talk loud. Okay? Because you're in a space and it changes your behavior. When you and I remember that person I'm talking to, that person I'm arguing with, that person I am interacting with, or that person I live near, or that person I go to church with, or that, if they're a believer, Christ indwells them too. And I'm going to illustrate this with a story. It is a parable. It's not, to my knowledge, it's not true. And it comes from a Catholic bent. But there was a story of some monks who lived in this cloistered old monastery. And they were kind of complaining how everything had kind of ran down. The funds were drying up. The monastery, not a lot of people came by anymore. Just not a lot was happening. There's just a few old monks that lived there. And So one day the abbot, or the one who's in charge of the monastery, he goes to visit an old rabbi who lived near there. And the two of them converse, and they were talking, and the rabbi said, yeah, in Judaism there's just been a lot of lost interest, and blah, blah, blah. And the abbot, as he's about to leave with the rabbi, he says, do you have any piece of advice for me? He said, well, I really don't. I was going to say that one of you is the Messiah. Now again, remember, this is a parable. This is not true. This is a made-up story with a point, okay? So this abbot goes back to the monastery and tells the other monks. They said, well, how was your visit with the rabbi? And he says, well, it was good. But he had this one cryptic, odd thing to say. He said that one of us is the Messiah. And they began to think about that, and they ponder it. Well, if one of us is the Messiah, is it the abbot who's the Messiah? You know, he's in charge, he's leader, or is it brother so and so? Because he's really good with, you know, with studies and with the word, and or is it brother so and so? Because man, he spends a lot of time in prayer. Or is it brother so and so? Because he's just so compassionate and so kind. And the more that they began to live there in that monastery, again, this is a parable, didn't happen, okay? Painting a story, using the story to teach a message. They began to change how they treated each other. When they remembered or they treated each other as if the other person was Christ himself or the Messiah, they began to change how they treated each other. And over time, there was a whole turn at that monastery. It began to grow and to flourish and have an influence in its community. Now, I wish I could change the story to make it something else, but it just kind of fit well with the context of the story. But when believers interact with each other as if they're interacting with Christ, when we show the love of Christ, I think Christ said something to his disciples like, by this shall all men know that you're my disciples if you have love one toward another. How we live matters. Yes, God's presence is within all believers. But how do we treat each other and live in light of that? So again, back to the key question I'm asking here. What is the trajectory of your life? We've traced trajectories in the Bible. Some books have an upward trajectory. Some have a downward. Judges is a downward trajectory book. But is God's presence, is it marked on your life? Or is it like the elders weeping at the second temple as its celebration or coordination's for a king, but as it's put into practice and it's commemorated because it's finished, and the elders weep because God's presence wasn't there. Is your life like the intertestamental Jews, where they have a form and a practice, but they're missing the power of God's presence? Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word here this morning. And although we didn't dig into a specific verse and a specific story, as it were, Lord, it just seems like time and time and time again, when humans can fail, we will and we do. And we're so thankful that our eternal security and our salvation is not based on our performance, but it's based on the finished work of Jesus Christ. And our only response to that is to exercise faith and rest in what His finished work on the cross. But Lord, as we're honest and we look at our own lives, we can see some of those same patterns and habits of turning from You, turning to our own understanding, turning to what makes sense in our eyes and fudging this and fudging that to make sure this works or that works, when we need to lay our lives at Your feet. We need to recognize we are the presence of God dwelling in us. Our bodies is that temple. And as we go in and through life, as we encounter people at work and at the store, people should notice and see how we are marked by Your presence. And yes, we're still sinners. And yes, we still struggle with sin, and we will till the day we die. But I ask that you help us to walk like the book of Judges, like the book of Joshua, where we are walking in consistent victory in faith, dependent on you, and surprised by defeat, rather than continually struggling with the same sin over and over and over again. And Lord, I ask that you would, as we think about the fact that you are living in our midst and among us, you dwell with us, would it change how we treat each other, how we listen, how we speak to one another, what we do for one another. Lord, may this church be known in our community as a church where it's very clear that as a body we love one another. And as we reach out into the community, we love people and want to draw them to Christ. Lord, as we close out here this morning, I ask that you do a work in hearts that only you can do. As Laquita begins to play a hymn of invitation here, let me ask you to just consider your trajectory of life. This is the first sermon of a new year, and it's kind of an artificial way where we get a new starting point. But what's the trajectory of life going to be for you this year? Do you live as if God is dwelling in you? You treat other believers as if God is dwelling in them. That response you made when you were irritated, would you have responded that way if it was Christ standing there? Father, we're thankful for the examples we have in Scripture, both good and bad. But we're thankful that through our failures, not just corporately as humanity and not just as a body of the church, but our failures as individuals, they're covered under the blood and by your grace. May we walk in light of that as you equip and enable us to move forward by faith, resting in your promises. Would it change our perspective of one another and how we live? We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.